The head of Britain's most successful cocaine smuggling operation was jailed for 30 years after a judge told him that he had gambled for the highest stakes and eventually lost. Brian Wright, a 60-year-old gangster nicknamed the Milkman by his criminal associates because he always delivered, was told it was possible that he could die in prison. "You were a criminal mastermind, manipulative, influential and powerful," Judge Peter Moss told Mr. Wright at Woolwich Crown Court in London. "I accept that you will be a very much older man when you are entitled to be released. I accept too it is a possibility that you may not live that long. Nevertheless, cocaine abuse continues to cause unquantifiable misery to tens of thousands of victims of other crimes committed by those using or seeking to use it. You played for the very highest stakes and won for a number of years. A very luxury lifestyle. You very well knew the consequences of detection and conviction." Mr. Wright was brought to trial after 11-year investigations by customs officers, which saw 19 members of his gang, including his son and former son-in-law, also jailed for drug trafficking or money laundering. While amassing a fortune estimated to be as great as £500 million, Mr. Wright, a lifelong gambler, used some of his fortune to bribe jockeys and trainers, and to arrange for racehorses to be doped. He would then bet £50,000 or more on rigged races, and used the proceeds to conceal the true source of his wealth. He hid for several years in northern Cyprus, which had no extradition agreements with Britain, but was arrested after travelling to Spain in 2005, laying low in a London bail hostel after being surprisingly released from prison halfway through his 30-year sentence. Brian Wright may have reflected on his fluctuating fortunes. During the 90s, he built the biggest drug empire Britain has ever seen, buying vast amounts of cocaine from Colombia's murderous Medellin cartel, smuggling it into the South Coast ports. He was known as the Milkman because it was said he always delivered. Reputed to have amassed around 100 million to 600 million pounds, he kept sumptuous homes in Chelsea Harbour, the Surrey countryside, and on the Costa del Sol. He entertained establishment figures in his hospitality box at the Royal Ascot, and rubbed shoulders with celebrities such as Michael Caine and Frank Sinatra. Mr. Wright was then so powerful that when he arrived at Tramp, a London nightclub, to find Clint Eastwood and Jerry Hall occupying his favourite table, he only had to wink at the manager to have the pair discreetly moved. With his tousled dark hair, lantern jaw, and $1 million smile, the charismatic cocaine baron might easily have passed for a film star himself, though the common perception was that he had made his millions as a highly successful horse racing gambler. When Mr. Wright's friend, a Cheltenham Gold Cup winning jockey Graham Bradley, asked him what he really did to have so much money, he replied tersely, "It is West London brogue, this and that." Wisely, Mr. Bradley never raised the matter again. In 1999, however, the Milkman finally couldn't deliver. His international drug-running gang, the Wright Organisation, was smashed after a 6 years customs and exercise investigation, as 16 of his henchmen were jailed for a combined total of more than 200 years. Although Mr. Wright himself evaded capture, fleeing to northern Cyprus, which has no extradition treaty with the UK, before sneaking into Spain in 2005, where he too was eventually caught. After he was convicted of conspiring to import cocaine, his barrister, Jerome Lynch QC, told Woolwich Crown Court that, as Mr. Wright was then aged 61, his 30-year sentence meant he would probably die in prison. Yet this pronouncement has proved well wide of the mark, for according to a well-placed source, as he sauntered through the gates of HM Prison Whitemoor in Cambridgeshire on April the 14th, the Milkman, now 73, looked remarkably spry. He has been reunited with his bodybuilder son, Bryony, who's 52, who himself served a 16-year jail sentence for being part of his drug scam. Soon he hopes to see his daughter, Joanne, and meet his grandchildren for the first time. Meanwhile, on Facebook, those and Mr. Wright's tight-knit inner sanctum have been effusively celebrating his freedom. "Unbelievable feeling for you and his family and friends," one gushers. "Can't put into words the emotions we are all feeling," replies his daughter, adding a smiling emoji with red love hearts. Glamorous old photos of Mr. Wright with his late wife Josie, who who died soon after he was jailed in 2007, have also been posted. Another faded snap shows him with the comedian Jim Davidson, with whom he jointly owned a racehorse in his heyday. Mr. Davidson, who chose Wright to be a godfather to his son, appeared as a character witness at Mr. Wright's trial, describing the allegation that he was a drug trafficker as laughable. The former England footballer and racing trainer Mick Channon also spoke on his behalf. In less troubled times, Mr. Wright's early release would have caused quite a stir, for he flooded Britain with drugs that caused untold misery and destroyed countless lives. As he is over 70 and underwent a triple heart bypass whilst on the run, placing him in the vulnerable category, the suspicion was that he might have been freed under the controversial scheme whereby 4,000 prisoners were to have been let out to prevent the disease spreading through the jails. However, this plan was scrapped just before Mr. Wright was let out, and the authorities say he simply became eligible for release under license midway through his sentence. What is very unusual though, is that he spent no time in an open prison, but was held in Category A Whitemoor until the last day of his sentence. Whatever the reason for this, the revelation that the Milkman is no longer under lock and key invites some pressing questions. Might he now try to resurrect his industrial scale smuggling operation? After all, during his 13 years inside, he maintained an impressive physique, and mentally, he is still sharp as a tack. And what became of his once colossal fortune? At a confiscation of assets hearing after his conviction, Customs and Excise demanded that he pay back £45 million. Claiming that he was stony broke, however, Mr. Wright refused to attend court. His position is he has nothing, and no matter how much he says it is, that will not be accepted, said his barrister Mr. Lynch. Everything he had was paid for in cash and rented. The approach the Crown has taken is so unrealistic that it is pointless engaging, and he takes the view that it almost doesn't matter. He is nearly 62 years of age and is serving 30 years. He will not see the light of day. Alluding to the death of Mr. Wright's wife a previous year, Mr. Lynch asked rhetorically whether a man with £45 million would have allowed her to spend her last days in a rented Spanish apartment. His pleas was successful. Judge Moss ordered Mr. Wright to hand over just £2.3 million within 12 months, or have his sentence increased by an additional 10 years. The drug lord paid up, having sold his 1.5 million Spanish villa, which he mockingly named El Letro, which was Spanish for the Milkman, and all his other assets to pay off the debt. He really is, on his uppers, totally skinned. But many are equally sure that Mr. Wright won't live out his life in financial struggles. He'll be looked after by the same people who he took care of when he had money, claiming the Irish mob would be among Mr. Wright's main benefactors. Can this all be true? Or has the shadowy figure, who has never held a bank account or used a credit card, and doesn't even have a national insurance number, which, in the words of one investigator, it was if he didn't even exist, secretly salted away his millions? We can only guess, for throughout Brendan Brian Wright's life, nothing has ever quite been as it appeared. Born in Ireland, he moved to London with his parents and many siblings in 1958 when he was 12, settling amongst the working class Irish community in Cricklewood. He often played truant from school and was a little bit of a tearaway until his wings were clipped, as he once put it, by a spell in Borstal. Desperate to move up in the world, he saw his chance in his teens when he earned a few pounds by running to the bookmakers to place bets for local workmen. Seeing how much they lost and how little they knew about racing, he began to study the sport and make small wagers, often winning. His first big payday came in 1964 when he staked £350 on the St. Leger and scooped £5,000 back. By the 80s, he was making tens of thousands on the turf and was a familiar and very popular face at the racetracks around the country. To his many high-profile friends in the racing fraternity, his extraordinary success came down to an encyclopedic knowledge and brilliant judgment. But in Racing in the Dark, his definitive book on corruption in horse racing during that period, author Richard Griffiths describes how Mr. Wright orchestrated an audacious fixing racket. Jockeys riding favourites were bribed to lose. Horses were injected with jungle juice that slowed them down and allowed outsiders through that Mr. Wright had backed to win. Former jockey and trainer Dermot Brown claims in the book that he rigged races for Mr. Wright from the late 80s. When Mr. Brown found the gangsters' cohorts in the Goodwood stables armed with syringes, he wanted out, but he was frog-marched at gunpoint to see Mr. Wright. Reclining at a bar in a swanky London hotel, he accepted £10,000 to run the doping squad, but to be honest, he had little option. The scam rolled on undetected for years, as Mr. Wright admitted in a lengthy interview given to the News of the World from his overseas hideout in 2002. In a cynical attempt to portray himself as a mere racing treat rather than a kingpin of a drugs ring. Mr. Wright told the paper he sweeted jockeys by introducing them to showbiz friends, none of whom had any idea he was a crook, and supplying them with top-class prostitutes. If I need a rider to win or lose, he did. If I wanted to fix a race, I could, he boasted. People think I made my money from being a drug baron. Well, I didn't. I made a fortune in gambling. Although Mr. Wright is banned from any involvement in racing until 2023, there are fears that the Milkman may see it as a cash cow again, now that he has been released. This fear prompted the British Horse Racing Authority to issue a reminder this week that he remains persona non grata. But his claim that he made all his money from horse racing was far from the truth. By 1998, when investigative journalists exposed him as the Mr. Big behind racing's biggest scandal, Mr. Wright had moved on to far richer pickings. For the man who, in the words of his friend Graham Bradley, always carried a wad of cash thick enough to choke a donkey, placing huge cash bets had simply become a means to launder the millions he was making from the drug trade. He seized the chance to do business with the Medellin cartel after being introduced to Ronald Soros, a Brazilian with connections to the ruthless Colombians. Whether this was before or after their leader, Pablo Escobar, was shot dead in 1993 is unclear. In any event, a deal was struck. The cartel would load watertight sacks of cocaine onto a light plane and parachute them onto the decks, or within grasping range, of boats sent by the Wright organisation to a rendezvous point in the Caribbean. When the boats came close to the British coast, the drugs were transferred to small yachts and motor cruisers, borrowed from Mr. Wright's unsuspecting friends in the affluent Howard's Way set, then dropped at small ports in Hampshire, Dorset and Devon. In that way, they evaded custom checks for years. The resulting profits were split 50-50 with the Medellin cartel. As one investigator later remarked, it was the most sophisticated and successful global cocaine operation ever to target the UK. One newspaper reported that the street value of the trafficked drugs topped £1 billion. The supply line might have still been running today if not for the forces of nature. In 1996, a storm blew one of Mr. Wright's motherships, the Sea Mist, off course, and it was forced to take shelter in Cork Island. During a routine search, custom officers found 599 kilograms of cocaine, worth £80 million, inside the welded up cargo lift. This clearly was not a one-off smuggling operation. So began Operation Extend, a painstaking covert investigation that brought Mr. Wright down. It reached its pinnacle in 1998, when 427 kilograms more of the white powder, with a street value of £61 million, was found in a lock-up garage in Essex and on a farm in Middlesex. But it would be a further 7 years before the semi-literate yet fiendishly clever criminal mastermind was behind bars. Whether out of fear or genuine admiration, you will be hard-pressed to find anyone with a bad word to say about Brian Wright. Likeable, personable, generous, and charismatic are among all the adjectives used by former friends to describe him. Whatever the truth about Brian's morals, he was a very nice guy. Bradley, who was banned from racing for 5 years for passing inside information to Mr. Wright, wrote in his autobiography, "If he walked in here now and sat at this table, you'd like his company. I'm just disappointed that his business was actually what it was. It doesn't seem as if the case against him was well proven, and it would be good to hear his side of the story." According to one source, he was equally popular and respected in prison, where his status was enhanced by reports of his £600 million fortune, rumours he did nothing to dispel. Some even regarded him as a latter-day Robin Hood, whose crimes had harmed nobody. Given some of the characters of whom we've been linked to throughout the years, this seems a fanciful notion. They include the great train robber turned drug peddler Charlie Wilson, who was shot dead in his Marbella villa in 1990, and Roy Atkins, who was alleged to have ordered a hit and was himself murdered months later. There are also one or two intriguing names amongst his children's friends. A member of the Arifs, a fearsome Turkish crime family, who for many years rivaled the Adams for supremacy of London's underworld. It's a small wonder that the Milkman's friends are confident that he will live comfortably now that he is free.